The chilly wind nipped at my skin as I stood at the gravestone, but I hardly noticed it. No matter what the weather threw at me, the weight on my chest was greater. My father, who had reared me, taught me the value of perseverance and constantly urged me to stand my ground. He was no longer with me. The priest's remarks were indistinct. I saw the coffin descend into the ground. The last farewell. Derek, my older brother, stood rigidly next to me, his fists clenched. He wasn't in grief as I was. I knew him too well to be duped, but his face was expressionless. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw taut, yet he was waiting, not grieving. And sure enough, Derek seized my wrist and dug his fingers into my skin as soon as the funeral was over, before the guests had even had a chance to depart. We must speak. Knowing where this was headed, I sighed. Not here, Derek, I said, looking around at the distraught family members. But appearances were never important to Derek. Transfer my share of the bequest to me. Right now. My gut twisted as I turned to face him completely. Our childhood house, our father's wealth, and most of his assets had all been left to me. He knew Derek, but not because he was partial. He was aware that Derek would spend it all in a matter of months, just as he had done with his personal funds after our mother died and left us each a tiny inheritance. Fairness wasn't the point here. It has to do with accountability. Even though my heart was racing, I said, I don't think this is the time, in a firm voice. Derek shook his head and scoffed. Stop being so rude, Olivia. We're family, even though I know Dad left you everything. The money remains motionless. I'm worthy of my part. I inhaled deeply and slowly. Derek, Dad made his choice. It wasn't created by me. His lips curled into a sneer as his eyes grew dark. You believe you are deserving of everything? Haven't you always been Dad's little favorite? The charge struck a deeper chord than I cared to acknowledge, so I swallowed hard. I muttered, This isn't about favorites. Trust is key. Derek gave a little sour laugh. Bullshit. I needed it more than you did, Dad knew, that while I suffer, you would simply hoard it. A searing heat burned behind my ribs as I tightened my fists. I answered calmly, Derek, you don't struggle. You're a waste. It was that. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as his face flushed. In a low, angry voice, he said, Olivia, you'll regret this. You're going to regret this. I promise you. My father's last words echoed in my mind as I stood there as he turned and walked off. Olivia, don't entrust him with your money. He will use it to ruin himself. Before I could even have time to grieve, greed showed up. 2 weeks later, Derek's most serious error. After 2 weeks, I was able to breathe normally again. I was over the funeral. After taking care of the estate and resolving Dad's issues, I made an effort to move on. I even planned a little trip to Spain in the hopes of temporarily escaping the stress of everything. I allowed myself to appreciate it for the first few days. I sipped wine by the beach, strolled through Barcelona's streets, and allowed myself to grieve unhindered. Then my phone buzzed on the 4th day. I looked at it in anticipation of a notification, possibly a friend's message. However, my stomach fell as I saw Derek's name on the screen. With a knot of dread in my stomach, I hesitated before opening the text. I read it after that. Dad's house is mine. I now own it. The locks were changed. There is nothing you can do about it. I blinked. Read it twice. Then, in the middle of a calm cafe, I burst out laughing. Because Derek, idiotic brother, my beloved. He had just committed the most foolish error of his life. I was also going to give him a lesson he would never forget. The configuration, I grinned as I sipped my wine slowly while leaning back in my chair. Did Derek truly believe that he could simply walk into my father's house, take it as his own, and be done with it? Was he really under the impression that a lock change would nullify legal ownership? I put down my drink and began typing on my phone, my fingers getting tighter. Derek, that's adorable. Tell me about your experience with that. After hitting send, I scheduled the first flight back home. I was tired but incredibly concentrated by the time I returned to the city. My initial action was to give my lawyer a call. Olivia, Mr. Holloway said in a kind although formal tone. I take it you're calling regarding your brother? I let out a sigh. You make the right assumption, I assumed. A few days ago, the home security system alerted us to unauthorized entrance. I wasn't shocked. My dad had been careful. His will was unchangeable. The house was still legally mine, and my legal team was still keeping an eye on the security system. Derek believed that I had given him something. Actually, he had just broken into someone else's house. I paced my flat and stated, I want to handle this smartly. I don't want a protracted court case. I want this to end quickly. Holloway mumbled something. You can choose between two choices. Before we escalate, file charges for theft and trespassing, or offer him an opportunity to leave on his own. I grinned. I was aware that Derek would not voluntarily depart. However, I was also aware that giving him the appearance of control would only make his demise more delightful. I said, let's give him a little rope. We'll see how much he uses to hang himself. I drove up to my father's house, which I was legally the owner of, that evening. I didn't knock. I tried the door handle instead. Locked. Anticipated. The doorbell rang. Nothing. I gave it another ring. Nothing has changed. I grinned. Derek, oh. In reality, he was acting as though he weren't at home. All right. I took out my cell phone and called him. Inside the house, the phone rang. Through the door, I could hear his annoying ringtone. I waited. At last, he responded, Olivia, what do you want? I grinned. Well, to begin with, I want my home returned. On the other end of the phone, Derek laughed bitterly, as if this whole thing were a huge joke. Your residence? He sneered. You mean our home? In fact, it took me a while to realize how naive he was. He genuinely believed that entering a house that wasn't his somehow made it his. I rubbed my temple and let out a breath. I'm not sure how to break it to you, Derek, but the house you're now occupying is legally mine. You are intruding, he gave a snort. Yes, exactly. Dad wouldn't treat me that way. I gave an eye roll. Derek, Dad didn't let you down. You subjected yourself to that. He stopped talking. I continued. Years ago, you destroyed everything Mom left you, squandered every penny you ever had, destroyed every relationship, and betrayed Dad's confidence. In a house that was never yours, you are now playing house. His tone became piercing. You're not worthy of it, I said calmly. That's not up to you. Now, before I involve the law in this, I'm giving you one chance to leave. A silence was followed by a slow, derisive laugh. Yes? And, little sister, what precisely are you going to do? Make a police call? I grinned to myself. Want to place a wager? I hung up after saying that. The following morning, Derek, it's time to go. I got up early. I made my coffee. I then called a couple of numbers. I returned to the house by noon, but this time, I wasn't alone myself. Beside me, a locksmith van arrived, and a man wearing a dark jacket emerged with his clipboard. Olivia Carter? He inquired. I affirmed, that's me. He flipped through the papers and nodded. This is your evidence of ownership. Okay, let's get started. As the locksmith and his helper began their work, I crossed my arms. The moment I had been anticipating finally arrived 10 minutes later. It threw open the door, and there he was, Derek. His eyes were flaming with anger, and his face was flushed. How in the hell are you doing this? I grinned. I motioned to the locksmith, changing the locks. You know, because you altered them without authorization. His mouth fell open. You can't just, I said, but I can. This house is mine, Derek. You don't. I offered you the opportunity to go alone, but you chose not to. Okay, so now? You are not given an option. The locksmith nodded and gave me my new keys. Everything is set, Miss Carter. I looked back at Derek. I'll call the police if you try to get in the way. Anger swiftly covered the small widening of his eyes. This isn't over, he said in a low, irate voice. I cocked my head. Oh, Derek, it's over. However, if you persist, I will ensure that things worsen for you. He knew he had lost this round, but his hands were still clenched. He gave one more sneer and bounded off in the direction of his vehicle. Until I saw him drive off, I remained motionless. I then entered, shut the door, and secured it after leaving. My home. My guidelines. Derek was done playing. Right now? Now it was my time. The house was never Mark's true issue. Sitting in Dad's favorite armchair, I gazed at my phone's flashing security camera footage. I knew better than to expect Derek to overlook this, but the house was once again mine. He was obstinate from the beginning. He was always too cocky to acknowledge defeat. However, this time, it was more than obstinacy, it was desperate. and I understood why. Dad had left a very clear will. I received the estate, the savings, and the house. Not because Derek was superior to me. However, I was the only one who refused to burn it all down. Derek had done that to himself before. How we arrived Derek had always been careless as a child. But things took a turn for the worse after Mom died. She had left us each a modest legacy of $200,000. It was meant to assist us in beginning our lives, a safety net, a present from a mother who had concerned herself with our destiny. I stored mine, put money into it, make good use of it. Derek? He partied it out. Initially, it was just lavish trips, pricey automobiles, and club nights where he tossed cash around as if it were limitless. However, what if the funds ran out? He resorted to something worse. Substances. His inheritance vanished in an instant. He was left with nothing after a year. Dad made an effort to assist him. All of us did. Rehab, interventions, financial assistance, wasted. Like clockwork, Derek would relapse after a few months of sobriety, during which he would adamantly turn his life around. The final instance, he took it from his father, $10,000. Lost. All night. Dad finally came to terms with the reality at that point. One night, Dad informed me in a heartbroken voice, "I can't give him another chance, Olivia. I'm not here to stay. And if he controls everything after I leave, he will ruin himself. I refuse to allow that to occur." Dad's will had been so detailed for that reason. Derek wasn't born to be mean. To protect him from himself, he was severed. Derek, however, did what he always did and did not take that as a wake-up call. Took what wasn't rightfully his. Derek's final argument, I didn't get much sleep that night. I waited for the inevitable while keeping my phone nearby and keeping an eye on the security warnings. Then, around 3:12 in the morning, it buzzed on my phone. Motion was detected at the front door. I felt sick to my stomach. I launched the application, and there he was, Derek. Wearing black clothing, he carried a duffel bag on his shoulder. However, what caused my blood to freeze? He wasn't by himself. Beside him, another man was standing, someone I had never seen before. I realized immediately what was going on. This was not an inebriated visit. It was a burglary. I instantly dialed 911 as my hands clenched around my phone. 911, tell me about your emergency. I spoke steadily. My brother is attempting to enter my home. He is not by himself. I currently have security cameras at my front door. The dispatcher spoke in a composed tone. Are you inside? Yes, and there are locks on the doors. Officers will arrive shortly. Hold on to the line. With my pulse pounding in my ears, I let out a shaky gasp. It was official. Derek had gone too far. And now? There would be actual repercussions. As I viewed the security tape, I sat in the dark, clutching my phone, my heart racing. Derek was standing at the front door, whispering to the man beside him. It wasn't necessary for me to know who the other man was. I knew exactly what was going on. This went beyond simple desperation. There was a plan, a foolish, careless, unlawful scheme. I continued to speak calmly but clippedly to the 911 dispatcher. I still have my brother at my front door. He's attempting to enter. The dispatcher spoke in a firm tone. Officers will arrive soon. Remain indoors and avoid interaction. Oh, don't worry, I was not going to engage. Officially, Derek had gone too far. And now? He was not escaping punishment. The police's arrival. My front yard was illuminated by flashing red and blue lights. I witnessed everything as soon as the police cars pulled onto my street. The other man? He took off running. Right into the dark. Disappeared in a matter of seconds. Derek? He stopped. I heard two officers emerge with piercing voices. Hands where they're visible! Derek's expression changed from one of confidence to one of panic as he turned slowly. The cops didn't think twice. They took hold of him, pushed him up against the police car's hood, and in a matter of seconds, they had the handcuffs on. He was being dragged away when I opened the front door. Derek's angry eyes locked with mine. You reported me to the police? I spoke steadily while crossing my arms. Derek, you broke into my house. What were you anticipating? A cop turned to face me. Do you wish to file charges, ma'am? Derek's arrogance wavered. I could see it in the way his hands trembled a little in the cuffs and his mouth tightened. I wouldn't do it, he thought. He assumed I would overlook it. He was mistaken. I made eye contact with him. Yes. The color faded from his face. They slammed the doors. Suddenly, Derek was out of the game. The repercussions, I didn't get any sleep that evening. My mind wouldn't stop working even after the police removed Derek, and my house was quiet once more. Because there was one indisputable fact that I couldn't deny, regardless of how much I hated him or how careless and self-centered he had been. He was my sibling. Furthermore, I had no idea how to keep him from hurting himself. The call from the jailhouse. My phone rang in the afternoon after that. An unknown number. I was aware beforehand. I paused. Then it was picked up. The initial voice was a robotic one. An inmate at county jail is making this prepaid call. To accept, press 1. I let out a slow breath. I then hit 1. Derek's voice emerged from the line a moment later. Are you content now? I gripped my coffee cup and leaned against the counter. You broke into my house, Derek. Quiet. Then, bitter and sharp, Dad's home. I shut my eyes. Let's get started. No, Derek. My home. In his testament, Dad bequeathed me the house. You were aware of a will. He laughed sharply and without humor. Yes, I was aware. I knew my father had betrayed me. I knew he had abandoned you. As if I didn't exist at all. I clenched my jaw. Derek, he didn't let you down. You were shielded from yourself by him. Quiet. He was breathing heavily as if he were holding something back, and I could hear it. Then, quieter, nearly shattered, he whispered, all I wanted was something that belonged to me. And I was hit harder than I thought by that. Because underneath Derek's haughtiness, anger, and careless choices, there was a lost youngster. A boy who had never really bounced back from our mother's death. A boy who lost all sense of direction and was unable to see a route back. I took a deep breath. Derek, you need help. One more sour chuckle. Your charity is not necessary for me. It's not charity, I firmly stated. I'm your sister, and I'm telling you that I don't want you to ruin yourself. Derek remained silent. However, he did not end the call either. The proposal I had a meeting with Mr. Holloway, my attorney, later that day. You're thinking of dropping the charges? He asked, leaning back in his chair and observing me. I gave my temples a rub. I'm not sure. I simply don't believe that incarceration will help him. With a thoughtful gaze, Holloway nodded. There is an alternative. I scowled. What? Rehab, was all he said. If he consents to enroll in a rehabilitation program, you could work out an agreement and withdraw the charges. Although it's not a perfect answer, it gives him an opportunity to change his ways and makes him accept responsibility. My thoughts were racing as I sat back. Would Derek consent to that at all? Would he even make an effort? Or would he think I was attempting to manipulate him in some other way? I went to see him at the county jail that night. He appeared worse, weary, empty, defeated. He seems to have finally comprehended how far he had fallen for the first time. I took a seat across from him, but he remained silent. I let out a sigh. I don't come here to debate with you, he sneered. Yes? So why do you come here? I'm here to offer you an option. He squinted his eyes. A decision? He laughed without a sense of humor. That's a lot of money. I didn't respond. I answered, I can press charges. I may let the court choose what happens to you. Or, I hesitated, carefully selecting my words. Rehab is an option for you. His face grew stern. No. Derek, I mean it. His voice became sharper as he said, I'm not going to rehab. I don't require, I interrupted him. Well, what do you need? One more arrest? Another cell night? Another slip up? He tightened his jaw. My family needs to stop acting as though I'm broken. My throat constricted. You are the reason we treat you that way. My comments made him wince. Turned away. I took out a leaflet from my backpack and slid it across the table. This is it. You have an option. But Derek, I need you to realize something. I won't leave you behind. I'm not excluding you. I'd like to assist you. But if you won't help yourself, I can't do that. He spent a long time looking at the leaflet. Then he grabbed it up without saying a word. I sat in Dad's armchair that evening and gazed at a framed photo of the two of us as children. Derek and I'm laughing, joyful, before everything broke down. Additionally, for the first time in a long, I gave myself hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, he might return. Derek didn't communicate with me for 3 days. He had to decide whether to go to rehab and attempt to start over, or remain in jail and deal with the repercussions. I had no idea which way my brother would go because I knew him. A part of me thought he would discard the booklet as soon as I walked out, to simply be stubborn and turn down the offer. Derek had never been the type to own up to his mistakes. However, another aspect of me, I hoped that perhaps just possibly things might be different this time. My phone rang on the fourth day. Unknown figure. I was hesitant to respond. Hey? A long pause ensued. Then a voice that was familiar, tired and harsh, but definitely Derek's. I'll do it. I was silent for a moment. Had I heard him correctly? What are you going to do? One more deep breath. Rehab. My chest felt lighter, as if I had been carrying an unseen burden all along. That's great, Derek, I muttered. That is excellent. His laughter was dry. Don't worry about it too much. However, his voice lacked bite. Just fatigue. I refrained from pushing. I knew him well enough to know that he would shut down entirely if I made this moment too emotional. I just said, I'll make the arrangements instead. The offer, I had another meeting with Mr. Holloway later that day. Are you certain about this? He flipped through the papers and inquired. You won't be able to file charges against him again if he leaves the rehab facility. This offer is only valid once. I gave a nod. I understand. He looked at me for a long time and then let out a sigh. All right. If he finishes the program, I will file the required paperwork to have the charges dropped. And suddenly, the route was established. A path out has been provided for Derek. It was his turn to accept it now. The journey to recovery, I took him there personally a week later. He drummed his fingers across his knee and stared out the window, mostly silent. Even though he would never acknowledge it, I could tell he was anxious. Derek whistled softly as we eventually arrived at the facility. It's a fancy place, he mumbled. Yes, it was. A large structure encircled by peaceful strolling paths and open meadows. It appeared to be more of a wellness retreat than a rehabilitation facility. I informed him that their areas of expertise were financial rehabilitation and addiction treatment. They will assist you in devising a strategy for your escape. Derek laughed. A strategy. Correct. After parking, I turned to look at him. This is your chance, Derek. I need you to be serious about it. He didn't respond. Rather, he simply gazed at the entryway as if it were a prison gate. He sighed at last. Olivia, without all the chaos, I don't know who I am. I was surprised by what he said. I took a swallow. Then perhaps I muttered, it's time to figure that out. He looked at me for the first time in years. Not with rage, not with bitterness, however, with a hint of remorse. Then he opened the car door and got out without saying another word. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him ascend the stairs. Would he remain? Would he flee? Would he really give it a shot? I had no idea. However, for the first time in a long time, at least now he made the choice. After 3 months. My phone buzzed as I was in the kitchen brewing coffee. Derek. I just stared at the screen for a while. I then opened the message after unlocking my phone. Derek, hello. Can we have a conversation? My fingers lingered over the keyboard as I paused. Then I typed back at last. Me. Obviously. When you're ready, give me a call. I had no idea what he was trying to say. I had no idea if he had changed. But I felt optimism for the first time in years. And perhaps, just possibly, Derek did as well. A final call, my phone rang an hour later. I inhaled deeply before responding. Hi. There was stillness on the other end for a moment. Then a long, leisurely breath out. Hey. I waited for him to speak before closing my eyes. I was wise enough not to push. At last, he declared, I'm out. He spoke in a different tone, less noisy, less jagged at the edges. The program was completed yesterday. I reclined in my seat. How are you feeling? Derek laughed briefly and without amusement, as if I had just left a fucking monastery. I gave a small smile, but I didn't return the jest. Was it beneficial? One more pause. Then, quietly indeed. I believe it did. I felt a sense of relief. He cleared his mouth. I wanted to express my gratitude for continuing to believe in me. The lump in my throat was swallowed. Derek, I was very close. I understand, he said in a gruff but sincere tone. I don't blame you either. I was deserving of everything, perhaps worse. I remained silent, because he might have been correct. Perhaps he deserved worse. I didn't want him to suffer, though. I'm trying, he acknowledged. I'm not sure whether I'll ever be normal. However, I wish to perform better. In years, for the first time, I did believe him. What happens next? We met in a little cafe outside the city a few days later. Derek's appearance changed. His hands were steadier, his face was less sunken, and he had regained some of his weight. However, beyond that, something else was present. Clarity. After rearranging his coffee in his cup, he looked up at me. "So," he said. "Now what?" I inhaled deeply. "That is up to you." As if he knew that already, he nodded. "I need a job." It was accurate. At that point, I made the decision I had been considering ever since he called. "I'll give you one?" Derek blinked. "What?" I bent over. "Dad's home. I own it. However, I don't want to stay there forever. It's too large for only me. However, it requires some effort." I looked him in the eye. When I said, "If you're serious about trying, if you're serious about changing," I hesitated. "I'll pay you to assist me in fixing it, give you a fair wage, provide a place for you to stay while you recover." His mouth tightened. "You have faith in me for that?" I maintained eye contact. Not entirely. Sincerity. "This was only going to work that way." I went on, "But I have faith that you want to improve. Additionally, I believe that Dad would have preferred that you be given the opportunity to earn something. Refuse to accept it. Not insist on it. However, earn it." Derek just stared at me while he sat there for a while. Then he nodded slowly. "All right." Months went by. Derek fulfilled his promise. I didn't trust it at first. I kept expecting him to make a mistake, vanish in the middle of the night, or revert to his previous behavior. However, he didn't. He got up early. He put in a lot of effort at work. He performed all of the dreary, tiresome, and boring tasks associated with house repair, such as sanding floors, painting walls, and removing years' worth of clutter. And Derek and I worked side by side for the first time in years. We didn't talk much at first, worked quietly. Then, gradually, we resumed our conversation, not only the house, however, regarding Dad, Mom, the items we lost, the items we still possessed. And Derek eventually spoke the words I never imagined hearing one evening as we sat on the back porch and watched the sun set behind the trees. "I miss them." I turned to face him. His eyes were focused on the horizon, his hands clenched together. "I regret wasting so much time in my anger." I tightened my throat and gulped. "Don't waste any more then," Derek nodded. But it wasn't that easy, as we both knew. It took time to heal. Forgiveness was difficult. However, we were making an effort, and that was sufficient for now. 1 year later, at last, the house was finished. New paint dot floors that are fixed, bright, clean, and alive once again. With beers in hand, we sat on the front steps and gazed at everything we had constructed together. Derek whispered, "I still can't believe you let me stay here." I grinned. "I still find it unbelievable that you haven't enraged me enough to expel you yet." He shook his head and breathed out a laugh. "Do you believe Dad would be pleased?" he asked abruptly. I looked over at him. A year ago, Derek was a different person. He didn't have a slouched, guilty expression. He wasn't so tired that his eyes were hollow. He appeared to be whole. I grinned. "Yeah," I muttered. "I believe he would." The last letter, I discovered it a few days later when organizing Dad's former office. A letter, addressed to both of us, tucked away in one of his books. I opened it, my hands trembling. "Olivia of mine. Derek, my Derek, I'm leaving if you're reading this. I am aware that things haven't always been simple between you two. I acknowledge that after your mother passed away, I wasn't always the best at keeping this family together. However, this is the one thing I want you both to keep in mind together. You are more powerful than you are alone. I am aware of your struggles, Derek. I am aware that you haven't had a good life. However, there is still time to make corrections. You still have the opportunity to be the guy I know you can be. And I understand that you feel the need to be the strong one all the time, Olivia, my darling. However, you are not required to accomplish it alone. You are kind. And I hope that you two end up getting back together no matter what. Because the only thing worth fighting for is love in the end. I cherish you both." Dad. Before the tears could fall, I dabbed at my eyes. Then I gave Derek the letter without saying anything. Silently, he read it. His voice was scratchy when he finally raised his head to face me. I wasted a lot of time getting upset. I gave a nod. Indeed. But now you're here, and I saw it for the first time. Derek also thought so. Going ahead. Not everything was resolved right away. Arguments persisted. It took a while for the old wounds to heal. However, we persisted. Derek secured a stable job. He began to save money. He even assisted other men in recovery from finding employment. And me? At last, I sold the house. Not because I was angry, not to forget the past. However, I was prepared to let it go. I relocated to a more compact space. One that was exclusively mine, free from the burden of the past. Derek, too? He was given a flat of his own. He used his own funds to pay for one. The final discussion, we got together for coffee a few months later. Derek looked better than I had seen him in years. He was robust and healthy. He grinned as we sat across from one another. All right, I was finally expelled from the nest by you. I gave an eye roll. You earned it at last. He stirred his coffee and was silent for a moment. Then, have you ever considered what may have occurred if you hadn't contacted the police that evening? I looked him in the eye. Yes, always. He shook his head and let out a breath. I would have perished. There was no question. It's just a fact. I took a deep breath. Yes, I said. You would have. Derek ran a hand through his hair while leaning back in his chair. After that, I detested you for a very long time. I understand. He looked up and met my eyes. But now? He breathed out slowly. Now, I believe it was the best thing I've ever experienced. I actually believed him for the first time. The last farewell to the past, we were outside Dad's grave a few weeks later. For the first time since the funeral, we were together. Derek dropped to his knees and ran his fingers over the name on the stone. I apologize, Dad, he whispered. I touched him on the shoulder. Derek, he knew. His eyes were sparkling as he gazed up at me. You believe so? I gave a nod. Yes. Derek got up and inhaled deeply. Then we all left together, not turning around, because we were no longer those individuals. We weren't avoiding our past for the first time in years. At last, we were making progress, together.